Good morning. A little bit different kind of a Saturday morning live stream than usual today. I'm joined with Rob Marro, who is an unironic friend of the channel, unlike Cardinal Supich. If for you longtime viewers, I used to joke about Cardinal Supich being a friend of the channel because I used to report on him a lot, never for good reasons. But Rob has been with us before talking about his late friend, Father Malachi Martin. Rob Marro is someone who knows or knew Malachi Martin in life better than most people. So he is in the process of writing a book, and I should say in the process of finishing a book. If you want to give an update on that, because I know some people will be very curious about where that book is now in the process.
Sure. And I hope you don't mind if I just throw in a euphemism of the writer's trade.
That's
Uh,
as long as YouTube won't hate what you say, I don't care.
no, among writers, when you get your first draft of a book done, and it's
Mhm.
literally you start writing and you get to the end of the last chapter, and you think, it's finished. No, it's actually just begun because what you've actually gotten down either on the page or on the screen your editor refers to as the vomit copy because
Yeah.
it's literally whatever came out of you and on the page in all its gory detail that needs to be cleaned up, edited, narration edited, story edited, copy edited, proofread, and formatted.
Right. So I remember this with my doctoral dissertation and my
Mhm.
master's thesis. My master's thesis I had to rewrite an entire chapter. I had to also do that with my doctoral dissertation because my committee chair, a Catholic, I had written a chapter talking about a what I called a disjunction in Catholic social teaching. What I always talk about when I mention it is how I got radicalized as a traditionalist
Right.
was reading documents by popes on how the church should handle social and political issues written before the council and the ones after the council were so blatantly different from each other that
Mhm.
it opened my eyes to something was seriously wrong. And I made a comment in that first draft about modernism and how that, this some would say that this is evidence of modernism. And my committee chair said in the margins, the church no longer considers modernism a heresy or something to that effect. And I was like, okay, so we're just going to scrap this chapter and start over. So the real work of writing, yes, the initial draft takes a lot of time. You will spend
Yes,
almost as much time revising it because it's not just fixing a
exactly.
typo or fixing, putting a comma where you should have put a comma and fixing a run-on sentence. It's also somebody saying, putting in the margins, hey, your thought here is incomplete. You need to flesh this out. And so now you have a lot more writing to do or fixing inconsistencies or whatever. But you're done with the initial draft. And that is a milestone that should not be discounted at all. And I bring that book up because we're going to talk about the book that is available right now that you have written, Ebenezer Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Love by
Yep.
Robert Morrow. To answer Laura's question that she asked in the chat before we started, this is
Sure.
a sequel of sorts to A Christmas Carol because, as you have said before, you've noted, maybe it was your wife who noted, that there's a couple of obvious glaring problems with A Christmas Carol that are never addressed. Hardline traditionalists will also point out that Ebenezer Scrooge was a usurer, and that's never really addressed. But you got to remember who
Mhm.
Charles Dickens was an Anglican, I believe, when he wrote that book.
Yes.
So they had a different view on usury than we do. But there are a couple of other glaring issues in the story, and so you address them. But a Christmas Carol is probably the most famous of all Christmas ghost stories. They used to be a tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas, and a lot of people that seems weird to us now because Coca-Cola successfully rebranded Christmas 100 years ago. That's where a lot of the modern imagery of Santa Claus comes from, is from Coca-Cola of all
Yeah,
people.
Coca-Cola ads.
Yeah, and, you know, culturally, I don't got a problem with Santa Claus as a cultural thing, right? I tell my kids that, Santa Claus is like a discount version of Saint Nicholas, right? Because that's what he is.
Exactly.
You know, he's for people who don't know who Saint Nicholas is. But, I'm not gonna bar them from seeing a movie about Santa Claus any more than I would about, you know, The Cat in the Hat or anything else. But there used to be a tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas, and it's really gone by the wayside. So I know you've recently done a little bit of research on other ghost stories. What are some of the uh, I don't know, ghost stories that people should know at Christmas that they should just maybe look up and read on their own, or key features of these kinds of stories, because they're not the same thing that people will tell around Halloween either.
Oh, exactly, exactly. Well, first off, I found out when I did a little bit of looking into the topic that in American popular culture, uh, ghost stories really only gets one mention at the holiday time. It's not a trick question.
Mhm.
Do you know what it is?
No, which one is it?
It's in the 1963 song by Andy Williams called "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year," where they talk about there'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long ago.
Hmm. You know what's interesting about that though is if you look at pop culture, you see this come up in pop culture at Christmas.
Mhm.
The one that comes to mind immediately probably dates me a little bit, but back in the 1990s, the X-Files had at least one X-Files episode that was a Christmas story. It was a ghost story set at Christmas. They were in a haunted house. I don't remember the details of it. Not endorsing the X-Files for the more puritanical people watching this, but I'm just saying they had one. So this is a and there are other examples of this, and it's something that permeates the culture. In fact, have you noticed that, like, I think it was the second Ghostbusters movie takes place at Christmas, or the first one does. There's, like
Yes,
it's not a Christmas movie, but for whatever reason, Hollywood likes to place these things there, and this is not part of the, like, subverting the culture stuff they do. It's just a recurring theme we see in popular
that's right.
culture, and, maybe it's more of an English tradition then of
Well, it
ghosts.
is. It is. A brief rundown is that it started back in the 16th and 17th centuries before the Industrial Revolution,
Mhm,
when, and it actually has its roots in a quasi Catholic slash Christian tradition
mhm,
of, you know, how Halloween came from All Hallows Eve, related to the next day being the Feast of All Saints.
okay.
So All Hallows Eve was deemed to be the night when ghosts and unsettled spirits walked the earth. And the tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas time in England made its way into Victorian England.
Mhm.
And that was because of the Industrial Revolution and the printing press,
Hmm.
because you had very cheaply available copies of ghost stories via what were known as the penny dreadfuls. And
These are the
uh,
precursors to what H.P. Lovecraft would be writing in, right? Because
exactly,
yeah, because he
exactly.
was like a dime novelist who wrote horror stories, and that man was very clearly disturbed, and if not actually being tormented by demons, by the way, if
That's
you ever
right.
read the biography.
That's right. But the tradition, the oral tradition that was handed down, usually by the older people in the family, like the old grandmother or the old mother, who would tell scary stories to the children as
Mhm.
cautionary tales, and basically to just frighten them for fun. Well, uh, that made its way into the Victorian era, and it became quasi glamorized, and it spanned, actually, it was very interesting. It spanned all social strata. It really did, from the very poor to the very wealthy. When you think of the recent hit series on PBS called Downton Abbey,
Mhm.
you know, the ghost stories appealed to that upper crust English strata of society as much as they did to poor Welsh coal miners on Christmas Eve. And it became a very embedded tradition within the United Kingdom. It never really made the jump over to the United States, with the exception of A Christmas Carol, which was a bestseller in the United States. But it never really made the jump. And a lot of people speculate that it didn't, because part of the origins of the United States was in the Puritans and the Quakers. And, well, first off, you know, in I believe it was the Massachusetts colony, didn't they ban Christmas for a while?
Oh, they did, and the Puritans and then the Quakers later were part of that branch of Protestantism that, eh, basically the only supernatural view of life they will take is the resurrection, and the
Yep.
ascension of our Lord and the life of our Lord and nothing else. This is where you get a like the we still deal with a lot of like the clinging of this to the culture through people looking for the devil in every bit of pop culture. If you're looking for Satan in pop culture, turn on whatever 100 is on your thing, on your radio, whatever the top 40 pop hits where it's all hedonism.
Of course.
That's where you're gonna find Satan. You're not gonna find Satan in country or most rock anymore. You're gonna find it in the person telling you to go do things that are not proper to your state in life. That's where you're likely to find it. But
That's right.
we find this in like everything, like the old D&D scare of the 80s. The most demonic thing about Dungeons and Dragons is how much of a waste of time it is.
Exactly.
People, teenagers and 20 something spending 30 hours in a week when they should be out getting a job or bettering themselves. That's probably the most demonic aspect of it. But you'll find this like in Protestantism, but you also see this among Catholics too, that you'll find this Satan in everything. And the problem when you look for Satan in everything is you might not see him where he actually is.
That's right.
And the consequence of that, of course, is, as somebody in the live chat here was saying, you can take these ghost stories. They have a moral purpose. They, to make you think about the four last things, make you think about sin. What was Jacob Marley's sin in A Christmas Carol? The whole thing, the whole story is. I have a hard time believing Jacob Marley was in eternal perdition because you don't really get to leave to warn other people if you're in eternal perdition. It makes me almost wonder if he had like a moment of repentance and now he was spending a whole lot of time in purgatory, and part of his purgation was to try to get Ebenezer Scrooge to walk away from the same path that he was on because it was going to be infinitely worse for him than
It's
it was.
fun. It's funny you mention that, Anthony, because that's one of the premises that my novel, The Ghost of Christmas Love, is based upon.
Mhm.
Is that it takes a more Catholic view of the state of Jacob Marley's eternal fate.
Mhm.
That he was serving an extraordinarily long purgatory because of what he had done with other people and the sin of usury and the abuse of money and control it gave him over other people's lives. He was spending a very long purgatory. And, in the various movies, whenever in that first scene, especially in the 1951 version of the movie, it was released as A Christmas Carol in the United Kingdom by Renowned Pictures, and it was released as Scrooge here in the United States. But there's that famous scene where the ghost takes Alistair Sim, who played Scrooge. He takes him over to the window and points out the window, and it shows the woman and her child suffering in the cold snow on the street below. Yet they are surrounded by all the ghosts who are filled with remorse and trying to intervene and warm them and give them something, and they're unable to. And Marley says, to Scrooge, heed this well to avoid my fate. And, if a spirit is damned, a spirit that's damned is filled with nothing but hatred and the wish for others to join it in its damnation.
Mhm.
So for him to come back to warn Ebenezer Scrooge, I have procured for you this chance. You will be visited by the spirits of three ghosts tonight. It's a more nuanced Catholic view of what happens after death than
Mhm.
just Jacob Marley went to hell, but he came back to try and be a good guy anyway. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow.
Mhm.
So, and the reason why I picked the 1951 version of the movie is, well, not that I put a whole lot of stock in the New York Times, but it is known as the paper of record. And their film critic, A.O. Scott, back around, I think it was around 1997, he said of all the 100 or so adaptations of A Christmas Carol that had ever made their way to the screen or the stage, that he thought the most authentic and definitive one in the entire Dickens canon was the 1951 version with Alistair Sim. And in that one, the woman that Scrooge, he broke her heart and she broke up with him, her name was Alice. And in that movie, she never got married.
Mhm.
She stayed a spinster and she worked on Christmas Eve in a Victorian homeless shelter, ministering to the poor and destitute of London. The other versions that subsequently came out after that all pretty much show Scrooge's fiancée as a woman named Belle, who happily marries a wealthy man and has many children. And they just remark about, I met an old friend of yours in the street today, and it was Ebenezer Scrooge. But that's not the way it was originally portrayed in the 1951 movie. And my book is a continuation of the events in that movie, because at the end of the movie, they all end the same way with, and as for Tiny Tim, who did not die, Scrooge became like a second father, and he learned to keep the meaning of Christmas in his heart all the days of his life, etc., etc. When the movie ended, my wife, she turns to me, she says, "I'm not really buying it." And I said, "What do you mean?" He had a change of heart. The ghosts affected a change of heart in him. And she said, "Well, if he really had a change of heart, he would have gone back and apologized to Alice, the woman whose heart he broke. And if not trying to get back together with her, at least to say, 'I'm sorry I wronged you. It was wrong, and it was my fault, and I'm deeply sorry.'" But they never show him doing that. Maybe it's inferred off screen, but it's never even hinted at. And my wife told me, she looks at me, she pointed, and she said, "That's the story you need to write."
And speaking of the story that you did write, we're talking with Rob Marro here, author of Ebenezer Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Love, which takes place immediately after the events of A Christmas Carol. It's available online right now. Amazon's probably the best place, I would say, just because the marketplace power that book has, which it's doing pretty well at this point, isn't it? I mean, from
Yes.
what you told me before, yes. So you can find it on Amazon. And for those who wonder why, partially because you see Malachi Martin in the title here, well, Rob is writing a book on Father Malachi Martin to help clear his name, because there's been a lot of fiction, a lot of smearing of the late Father Malachi Martin,
That's right.
and Rob Morrow knew him better than most people around today. So he is trying to clear his name. And this book doing well will help that book. So if this sounds like it's something of interest to you, or as a good gift for somebody you know who loves A Christmas Carol, you can find it on Amazon. You can probably find it on the publisher's website too. Who's the publisher of your book?
If you look on the website for Simon and Schuster and their related subsidiary called Post Hill Press, you can find it there as well. It's also available through Barnes and Noble and online for the Kindle, like you pointed out, at Amazon, but also Google Books and Apple Books as well.
Yes.
So it's got fairly wide distribution.
Yes, and you can also find it in some bookstores as well.
Yes.
I remember you sent me a picture from, was it Barnes and Noble that had it?
Yes, it was included in their holiday display, Gifts for Avid Readers.
There you go. So you can find it in a lot of places. The book performing well will help with the Malachi Martin book, and the objective is to help dispel the black legends about Malachi Martin, because it's not a coincidence, as I've said, that as soon as he wrote the book, the Jesuits, what happened to him? They tried to destroy him, and they
The
nearly
smear
succeeded.
campaign began hardcore.
Yeah. So, and as I've been trying to present to people Malachi Martin's writings and some of his lesser known interviews, he knew exactly what was going to happen. He just maybe he got the timetable wrong, but he knew what was going to happen to the church. So,
It's interesting. He was off, Anthony. He was off by one pope in Windswept House, which, in order to fully appreciate Windswept House, you really need to read his previous book entitled The Keys of This Blood, because that's more the scholarly explanation.
mhm.
And it almost reads like a college level text. And then, as if to say, all right, for those of you who are confused as to how the keys of this blood would play out in real life, here's the story. And he presented it rather well in Windswept House. And by the way, actually, not many people know this, is that Windswept House was not Malachi Martin's last book. Malachi Martin's last book was a small book and that came out posthumously in 2016 or 2017 from a manuscript that Malachi had left unpublished, and it was entitled A Priest and His Dog, the story of Taddy. And it's the story of him. It's very heartwarming. It's pretty much the exact opposite of what you might expect to read from Malachi Martin, but it's very heartwarming, and it tells the story of how the little Cairn, the white Cairn Terrier puppy that he acquired back around 1981, and it's going to sound odd, but I was privileged to interact with how she humanized him in a way that people couldn't. He talks about how his training as a Jesuit, the classical Jesuit training over the course of many years, taught him how to almost rid himself of emotion, to the point that when his parents died, he didn't shed a tear at their funeral. He didn't shed a tear at their wake. And the same with his brothers and sister. No emotion at all. And he had a reputation for being, when he wanted to, a very icy personality. And he said it was the Lord Jesus who didn't send him another person who was a living saint or a saintly confessor or a best friend who was a holy person with, deep emotions. Instead, he sent him a small white puppy.
Somebody was saying in the live chat, the link's too big. It takes 3 posts in the live chat, but someone was saying the book does not come up on Amazon when they search. It does. You have to search for it under the title. I found it. It was the first result under the search for Ghost of Christmas Love. And I will actually just put it on screen so you can see what I am talking about here. It's over here on Amazon right there. And so, yeah, it's there. You just look for, I did search for Ghost of Christmas Love, and that's what you will find. So it is available. I find Malachi Martin interesting as a sort of a cultural icon. He's not super widely well known, but whenever it comes up, whenever I put a video up like I did yesterday in the comments, the Art Bell interviews, I used to listen to those were great. I actually think the Art Bell interviews were not his best work, to put it mildly.
Without a doubt.
They were.
Without a doubt. I always tell people that if you want to hear clear, concise Catholic teaching from Malachi Martin's point of view, go to Triumph Communications in Canada and Bernard Jansen, who conducted a series of about 6 interviews with Malachi over the span of the 1990s. And in there, Malachi doesn't hold back, but everything is told from an Orthodox, traditional Roman Catholic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And he lays all his cards on the table regarding the state of the church, the various players mentioned in The Keys of This Blood and Windswept House, and he actually names names.
Mm.
It's very easy to listen to. If I've got a chore or a job to do, for example, out in my garden, I have no problem putting on one of Malachi's recordings with Bernard and just listening to that for 2 hours, and the work just flies by.
No, he was. Those interviews, I think, are the gold standard, and
yes,
supporting Bernard Jansen's Triumph Communications by purchasing them legally instead of finding them for free online somewhere, I think is the right thing to do. Back momentarily to the Scrooge issue. James North says in the movie Scrooge, Bill Murray's character Frank is the Scrooge of the movie. He actually apologizes at the end to his former girlfriend. That movie's a guilty pleasure for me because that movie is not we'll say a morally sound film, but a modern Scrooge would not be. You couldn't tell a modern 21st century story of Scrooge and have it be a pure story. It just would not work because that kind of character would get deep into all sorts of other sins besides just money. And it's true, that story, he does actually apologize to his girlfriend in it. Richard Corwin says he just put the book in this cart, which is great. Good. Glad to see people supporting it. And the book is good, and it makes a good gift. And also it helps. It helps in a small way to clear Malachi Martin's name, because there is a lot weird stuff said about him. A lot of weird stuff. People claiming to bring receipts that don't really mean anything, engaging in wild speculation, and listening to the accusations of someone who was quite literally certifiable, which means that his accusations wouldn't stand up under any kind of legal scrutiny. But they persist.
You're talking about the former journalist. I'll speak elliptically. The former journalist who was in Rome at the time of the Second Vatican Council when Malachi was there, and who, like you said, was diagnosed with a mental illness. Actually, an intervention was staged for him. That's not what they called it back then. Back then, it was a bunch of concerned people getting together and saying, okay, he's going off the rails. We need to do something.
Mm.
Do you know one of the people in that group was the liberal theologian John Courtney Murray?
Did not know that, but that doesn't surprise me because you said this was all during the council, wasn't it? Or right around
Yes.
Yeah.
It was during the Second Vatican Council.
Malachi Martin's role at Vatican II was to be a glorified, highly skilled secretary for Cardinal Bea.
Correct.
Because if you know anything about Malachi Martin's background, he was a polyglot. He knew how many languages did he speak? I mean,
12.
He spoke 12 languages, so he was going to be a good translator. It's why he was in the room when the Third Secret of Fatima was read, because he was a translator, and he was also the personal assistant to one of the council fathers. A council father that, if you listen to Malachi Martin, he speaks very fondly of, even though Cardinal Bea is frankly a notorious public heretic, or was. Hopefully he reconciled that stuff before the end of the council or before his end of his life. But, it was the spirit of the age, right? Cardinal Bea was not one of the necessarily...
It was the zeitgeist.
Yeah, he's not one of the good guys in the story of Vatican II, we'll say. He was not Ottaviani or Lefebvre or any of them. But that's why he was there. But he was essentially a secretary. That's why.
Yes.
But,
and the other thing I want to point out about the book about Father Malachi is a lot of people are talking about it as if it's going to be strictly a tell-all biography along the lines of what you see about, for example, the one that comes to mind is, didn't a bunch of so-called official tell-alls come out after the death of Princess Diana?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was a cottage industry.
Well, this is not that kind of book, all right? This book is not a formal biography. It's a memoir of the 10 years that I spent with my best friend. Mm-hmm. There's a big difference there between, there are biographic elements because things in the book don't make sense unless I relate things he told me that happened to him earlier in his life. And they are in there. All right. But there are also things in the book that he told me that, that I worked for the US government at the time. And the things in the book that he told me, I was able to independently verify.
Right. And this is where I won't give the game away, but if you read the novel Vatican, some people have asked him, I remember Art Bell actually asking him, what would you do if you were Pope? And he rattled off and how he'd be a terrible Pope whose reign would be mysteriously short or something to that effect. But if you read the novel Vatican, there's a character in there that is clearly Malachi Martin. And you will, in your book, make that much more obvious to people. So that's all I will say on that without giving away the spoiler. It's not much of a spoiler anyway, because while the novel Vatican is out there, the copies only go for $50 or $60 now, which is ridiculous because nobody is selling their copies of it. When this brings me to the other point, if you support this book and it does well, and then your book on Malachi Martin does well, that could motivate Simon & Schuster, the parent company of your publisher, to reissue some of those older books of his.
Oh, without a doubt.
Even in limited runs. And that would help keep his raising the alarm bells about things going on alive. Because if you read like The Rise and Fall of the Roman Church, and you read Vatican, and you read The Keys of This Blood, and you read Windswept House, he paints you a picture that Bob Ross could not have painted for you in its clarity about what was happening and what was coming down the road for the Catholic Church.
That's right.
But his books are out of print mostly. I think Windswept House and Hostage to the Devil are the only ones that are still in semi-active publication because of just how popular they are. And
the only other one, interestingly enough, that's still available on Amazon, I believe, is The Jesuits.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot to add The Jesuits to that lineup. But You know, he basically painted you a picture for about everything, and he was right about everything except he got it off by one pope. I don't think he
Mhm.
expected Ratzinger, who he a lot of people don't like this, but I remember he was asked by Bernard Jansen, "What do you think of Cardinal Ratzinger?" He says he's the best of a rotten bunch, which is not
That's right.
saying.
That's
And
exactly what he said. The best of a bad bunch.
right, and the reason he said that is because Cardinal Ratzinger, Benedict the 16th, was better theologian than probably administrator, governor of the church, honestly,
Mhm.
in terms of uh, a lot of the worst elements became cardinals while he was a cardinal and during his time as pope. I mean, they just did. And famously, just look at the letters between Ratzinger and Archbishop Lefebvre, and you get a pretty good idea because, again, it's matter of public record. Archbishop Lefebvre, the entire SSPX question hung on one answer that he could never get from Cardinal Ratzinger. And he asked Cardinal Ratzinger to reaffirm in writing the pre-conciliar teaching of the social reign of Christ the King. And he could never get him to do
That's
it.
right.
And that is what everything hinged on. And from that inability to do it, you got a CC in 1986 or 88, and then the consecrations of those bishops thereafter. Because if you cannot reaffirm what the church always taught about the reign of Christ the King, long before it became necessary to write it down, because Pius XI wrote it down because the world forgot what it meant for Christ to be king. And so he had to teach it as Pope.
That's right.
And then the
That's right.
modernists swept it away. If you look at
And
the
and people
if
and
you
the
look at
funny thing is people who they always like to look for the biblical source. And all you have to do is go back to the Gospels where Pilate kind of sneeringly looks at our Lord who's been scourged and says, "Don't you realize I have the power to crucify you or to set you free?"
Mhm,
And our Lord looks at him and says, "You would have no power over me unless it were given to you by my Father above."
mhm.
And that's where one of the key doctrinal statements of Roman Catholicism comes from, is that all governing authority, all ruling authority ultimately comes from God.
Speaking of that, let's let's talk about something in the news right now. You, are aware that Notre Dame is in the process of being reopened. It's been renovated after the fire, and you might remember a year or 2 ago, I reported here that there were some real wild designs for submitted
Oh yes.
to modernize Notre Dame. Thankfully, the French government said, "We're going to restore the building as best we can to be similar to what it was before the fire." Thank God for that, quite literally, because the designs were wild, real wild. But we have now the images and some video of Notre Dame. For the most part, they're pretty nice, but there are problems. So let's take a look at Notre Dame. And I'm curious what Father Malachi Martin might say about this. So let's start here with this posted by someone calling themselves Massimo. We're going to make sure this is muted because there's always copyrighted music, it seems like, in these things. So here's what it looks like now. And I have a problem already with what I see. Can you guess what it is?
Well, it's a little small on my screen, but there's no pews. It just looks like there's folding chairs.
There are chairs, and that's bad enough, but that's actually not my main problem with this. I mean, pews are a relative innovation. It's how
Mhm.
bright it is. Notre Dame, you've been to Notre Dame, you told me.
Yes.
Wasn't it not the most brightly lit place?
It was not the most brightly lit place. However, the that's the rose window, yes. Um, I think one reason why it was not the most brightly lit place is because it had hundreds and hundreds of years worth of carbon from tallow wax candles
Mm,
being burned at the many altars in the church, and they eventually darkened a lot of the walls inside the church. I think part of what you're seeing. Do you remember when they restored the Sistine Chapel and the
mhm,
Last Judgment?
yeah,
How previously it was very dark and all
right,
the
and that was
colors were very muted.
it was the candles that were doing
It
that,
was the
yeah.
candles. And it was the same way, I think, in Notre Dame, that the candles over hundreds of years, literally over centuries, continuously burning. It was the carbon smoke of the candles rendered it a dark place. I don't want to say gloomy because it was a church, but it was a dark place. You're right.
So here's the next one. We got some more footage just so we can, from a different angle. I think it's just from a different angle. If it's the same one, we'll skip it. But for a good look, again, it's nice to see that a lot of it was restored. That a lot of the statues were not completely didn't need to be completely replaced. They were restored by the best artists available in Europe. That's how you handle a restoration like this. And I will say, of any kind of thing, anytime we see a classic church structure touched by modern hands, it doesn't usually come out looking like this. I'm glad
It's
they
almost always a disaster.
right. I won't show the pictures here, but there's making the rounds right now of some renovated parish in, I think it's the United States or maybe it's in Spain, but it went from looking like a Catholic parish, a little dated by modern standards. It went from looking like that to just a brutalist looking, barren walled, white walls, high church Protestant looking building, which is unfortunate.
Right.
But you see, but they did handle this much better in most ways. And you got a glimpse here already of what I'm going to show you now, I think is my first real problem with what we have, because there are problems here. So we go here, Father V on X, a good follow, conservative, ordinary form priest, says, care to share any thoughts on the newly crafted liturgical furnishings for Notre Dame? So let's take a look at this. There, that's your altar.
Oh, Lord.
Right. So they couldn't help themselves. Okay. And then we go, here's your presider, and I guess for two deacons or an altar server or a bishop, here's your presider's chair. Notice how he's facing where the audience will be. And I say audience on purpose. I think that's supposed to be a tabernacle.
I don't know what it looks like, a tombstone.
Right. Yeah. And then you have, I'm guessing that's a holy water font.
I thought it was a soup bowl.
Right. No, right. That looks like the kind of thing you would go to some fancy kitchenware store or department store in their kitchen aisle and see that and go, oh, hey, look, some really kind of rustic but modern looking plates and things. That's what that looks like.
I mean, Anthony, let me ask you a question. Take away the cross, and doesn't that look like a stylized bowl of onion soup?
I mean, yeah, that doesn't even look like water in there. That does look, it looks weird. It's strange looking, but that's not the only thing. Let's go here to, let's take a look here to America First Post, who really focuses on that altar. The high altar is still there. There is this great fear in the church that you cannot say the ordinary form of the mass on a high altar, because then the priest has to have his back to the people, and it's not inclusive, it's not synodal. And so they put these abominable things and give them a pride of place.
Yeah, and it's an abomination.
It is. So again, they could not help themselves at all. And I know that some people really wanted to know our thoughts on this. And so this is the reliquary for the most, as according to Catholic Sat, the new reliquary for the most holy crown of thorns of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, one of the most important relics in the world in the newly restored Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris. It was designed as that pilgrims could come and touch the reliquary. Okay, fine. Let's take a look. And you know what it reminds me of in a way? It reminds me of something where you would watch like some sort of like vampire movie set in a slightly dystopian modern version. Think Blade or something. It reminds me of that kind of imagery.
Yes,
and I don't know
I
why
can
it
see
does
that.
it. Yeah, it's weird. And I mean, monstrances are always kind of strange looking to most people, and I get what they're going for here, but
It doesn't look holy.
no, that's what yeah, it doesn't look holy. It looks like modern art done by an artist with at least some sense of the beautiful, as opposed to
Mhm.
somebody who would tape a banana to a wall and get paid $40,000 for it. Right? You've seen that. You've seen those pictures, and that I'm not joking.
I've got to go to the grocery store then.
That's an art
I'm in
piece.
the wrong business.
That's an art piece that was on installation recently in some major European gallery. And now we will carefully talk about this part here. As reported by Michael Haynes of LifeSite News, famous fashion designer Jean-Charles de Castelbajac was handpicked by the Archdiocese of Paris to design vestments for the reopening of Notre Dame, according to the Associated Press. He famously made the Rainbow Cross vestments for John Paul II for 1997's World Youth Day and often uses that theme. Now, I'm not going to say that this is James Martin stuff here, but I will say that I can see why you would say it was, right?
I would say that tiptoes right up to the line.
It does, and I will. It's that won't even those vestments won't even make sense in the restored Notre Dame Cathedral, let alone at anything but the most we'll call exuberant and happy, to use a synonym, kind of parish. Think a New Ways Ministry kind of mass.
Right.
And this is what they're going to use for the or are going to use for the reopening, or maybe by now they have, although I think that mass is December 8th, if I'm not mistaken. This is going to be for their reopening mass. And I'm just curious, what would Malachi Martin have to say if he saw this stuff today? What would his thoughts be on the restored cathedral, the the very up-to-date table, altar, and all and these kind of vestments? What would his thoughts be? Because
I can sum it up in 3 words.
sure.
Regarding those specific elements you just spoke to, he would just look at it and say, it's not Catholic.
And he'd be right. I hate to be the one to tell people this. If you showed me an Anglican priest in this with this stuff, I would still say that was not even Anglican, not in the classic sense of what an Anglican is.
Right.
Maybe the Church of Justin Welby before he stepped down, and the very strange people who have taken over his post since then, they would be comfortable with it. But this is the new religion.
Yes.
Yes, you see a cross there, but it really is Christ without the cross. Or in this case, a cross without Christ. It's a cross without the sacrifice, without the suffering that goes into being a Christian. That's sort of core to the identity of a traditionally minded Christian. This whole thing is so strange to me that I was a little surprised to see that while they restored Notre Dame, mostly keeping with how it was beforehand, other than the lighting and a couple and other than those modernist things, I mean, obviously they couldn't help themselves. The Archdiocese of Paris isn't exactly known as having the most orthodox priests or the most orthodox bishops in the Latin.
Anthony, have you ever been to Paris?
I have not been to Europe in general. I'd like to. It's going to have to wait until my kids are older.
About 25 years ago, I used to work for the American Express General Counsel's office in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And every summer, I had to go on basically a tour of Europe for work, because the compliance officers and anti-money laundering officers that reported to me for the various markets, it was much cheaper for me to go and visit each of them in their countries than to fly all 10 or 12 of them over to the United States for a week. It was much cheaper for me to go there. And I would always end my business in London on a Friday so that I could then take the Eurostar train from London's Victoria Station to Gare du Nord Station in Paris. And just so I could have a weekend in Paris before work began on Monday.
Mm-hmm.
And I would visit Notre Dame, but I would visit Notre Dame as a tourist attraction because I had a rather disastrous attempt at confession there once. But I would go to the Society of St. Pius X Church of Saint Nicolas du Chardonnay in Paris. And although most people would look at that and say it was beautiful yet verging on decrepit, it was one of the most holy masses I've ever attended in my life. It was a sung high mass on a Sunday. Beautiful. And it was packed, standing room only, with ordinary people from Paris.
So we're speaking here today with Rob Marro, the author of this book right here, which you can find on Amazon. I found it by typing in Ghost of Christmas Love. That's the easiest way to find it. It'll be the first result, but it's Ebenezer Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Love, which is based off of the 1951 Alistair Sims telling of a Ghost of a Christmas Carol, and is a follow-up to that because there's a couple of glaring kind of unfinished pieces of business in that story that are resolved in this, and the hint is in the title. It makes a great gift. It makes great reading for yourself if you like those kinds of stories, and if you are interested in his coming book on Malachi Martin, that will help clear the air on Malachi Martin, as well as I think add to some of the mystery and enigma to it, given that I know some of the details in it. This will help that book come to fruition as well.
Well, it's not going to hurt that you're going to be a beta reader of the book either.
Well, there's that too. That's a spoiler. I will be doing beta reading, and no, I will not be spoiling it for you before it's released. But that's for transparency's sake. People will know. I'm not going to hide that I'm helping in my own small way behind the scenes. But I do enjoy that thinking, that Father Malachi Martin probably just roll his eyes at what they've done to and be kind of saddened by what they've done to Notre Dame, because it's for the most part very Catholic looking, but it's almost a good synonym for the modernist crisis in the church anyway, because for the most part it looks Catholic until you get to a few things that just don't. And the vestments, that weird looking monstrance that doesn't look like sacred art, it looks like an imitation of sacred art, I think is the way I would describe it. The renovation of the new altar settings, all that stuff is so strange.
It is.
Thank you for the super chat, JP. It is appreciated. Any questions in the chat? This is your time to get them in. Patricia in the live chat reminds us that Archbishop Lefebvre was baptized on this day, St. Andrew's feast day. Yes, and today is the novena of St. Andrew begins. So for those of you who are keeping to old traditions, this is a good way to do it. Before we wrap this up, if there's any final thoughts, Michael says, pray for the Reconquista, the eldest daughter of the church, meaning for the return of once Catholic France to the Catholic faith. And that is a fine thing to pray for, because that country needs it, especially not just because of the bad news out of the UK yesterday, which we won't go into too many details for. Just JP Murphy does ask, will there be a sequel to the Christmas novel? And according to Amazon, it says that the Lavinia is in the works, that there's a follow-up that you're already planning. So yes, there will be. Because JP, did you read the novel? I think you did. He says in an above further earlier comment that it's an awesome novel, so I'm going to assume that means he did.
Thank you.
Let's see. I can't read that, Chesty Marine. I'm sorry. That's a pretty crude comment, but it is funny. So, JP Murphy does confirm that he did read the novel. So, yes, please get a copy of Ghost of Christmas Love. It's a great gift, great book for yourself. And anything you want to wrap this up with, Rob?
Well, I think first off, I'm very gratified to everyone who buys the novel and supports my modest efforts. Number one, thank you very much. I sincerely appreciate it. Number two, I'm looking forward to getting the book on Father Malachi published. It's going to be controversial. I suspect I will be put on someone's blacklist in an office in Rome when it comes out, but I don't care. Doesn't matter to me. But it will tell the truth about the Reverend Dr. Malachi Martin. I will be bringing the receipts, some of which will be in the forms of photographs. And, it's going to be very hard to refute some of the things I say. People, will say some of it's hearsay because he told you, and that wouldn't hold up in court. And that's why I say this is not a formal biography. It's a memoir.
Right. And this is also, the easy refutation for that is so much of the things said about him are also hearsay.
Exactly.
But it's hearsay repeated by people who we have, for some reason, think have authority to trust.
Exactly.
And always remember the context about Malachi Martin. They didn't seem to mind when he wrote Rise and Fall of the Roman Church and other things. They minded when he wrote the Jesuits.
Exactly.
So
they came after him hard on that one.
Yeah.
And there's an entire chapter in the book about that.
Yeah. Like he knew what was going to happen when he wrote that.
Exactly.
All right. I am Cat's Minion says, obviously we will get a heads up for pre-order on the upcoming book. Yeah, before that book is out, I'll have Rob back on and we'll talk about the what the aim of it is and when the pre-order is up, because you want,
And there will be pre-orders.
yes, and I want to make sure we do our part to make sure that book gets up the charts as well, because the point of it is to clear the name of a much maligned priest who was actually still a priest.
Yes.
He
Till the
would,
day he died.
yeah, he said masses, he baptized, he when a local parish would let him sit in the confessional, he would do it. I mean, he was still a priest. He was not
I served his
laicized.
masses
Yeah.
when he would. There were times when, pardon me, there were times when people that he knew would communicate how badly their local parish had gone off the rails, and they would ask him to come and say mass in their home,
Mm,
and they would transform their upright piano, like an upright Yamaha piano, into the most beautiful traditional altar you've ever seen inside
mm,
a home. And he would say mass, and I would be his altar server.
right. All right. With that, folks, make sure to check the book. I will, if I can find a share link on Amazon, because so it's not like, a 15 paragraph long link. I will try to put a link in the pinned comments after this live stream is over. Thanks very much, as always, folks, for tuning in, and pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine with Rob Marro. Ave Maria.
Thank you, Anthony.